All right, let's move on to just like a general open discussion on psychological horror. I figured we would just kind of run through the decades, talk about the evolution of psychological horror, our favorite filmmakers within the space. Definitely in my mind, I think this is my favorite subgenre of psychological of horror. I don't know how you guys feel. I don't know what your favorite subgenre of horror are. So let's start with the '60s. Pop open them letterboxes.
I am doing it right now.
Yeah, I could wait.
I don't. I don't know if Tyler will get very far, to be honest. Okay, I've got some shit.
Yeah, I don't know about
I've got
60s.
some.
I mean, you've definitely
I've got some
seen
shit.
at least one from the '60s, so we'll start there. Psycho, other '60s, Rosemary's Baby.
Yep.
Those are really the only two psychological horror movies that I've
Persona
seen.
could be considered.
Yeah.
Well,
If-
I think Ingmar Bergman made one horror film, and that was the '60s, and that is most definitely psychological horror. It's called Hour of the Wolf.
Okay.
It's very reminiscent to like The Lighthouse, very in terms of like the surreal energy, but thematically it's similar to like a Persona or a Seventh Seal. That was like the only horror film Lynch ever made, and it's really, really good. I recommend you watch it. Actually, I think you'd like it. And then also there was another one called The Cremator, which is most definitely psychological horror comedy, I guess. That's really, really great. And George, I don't know if you've seen Eyes Without a Face.
I haven't. No.
So that's like that was one of the early, maybe body horror, psychological horror, whatever. That was like one of the early where they kind of pushed the envelope in terms of like graphic imagery. It was a French film from I believe like 60 exactly. I'd recommend everyone watch that. That's a really, really interesting one. And then you've got The Birds, Hitchcock's The Birds, which is shit. So I'm not talking about that. But, yeah, Rosemary's Baby. I think you mentioned that, didn't you?
Yeah, Rosemary's Baby and Psycho are like the two obvious. I've been seeing
Yeah.
George Romero's Night of the Living Dead on a lot of psychological horror lists, which like kind
I
of
guess
makes
so.
sense a little bit.
I
Like,
don't really love Night of the Living Dead, to be honest. I like the
Yeah, it's a 4-star for me.
Yeah,
I'm not sitting here saying it's one of the greatest. I was just surprised that it was on this list of psychological horror movies. It's like kind of looking at like 28 Days Later, like zombie movie, but somewhat of a psychological.
search search the
go.
alphabet. Go on Letterboxd, search the alphabet. It's David Lynch. That was 60s. Just
It's
look at the picture.
called
Look,
The Alphabet.
Is it a
just
short
look at the
film?
yeah, just look at the header for it. It's absurd, that film.
What am I looking at? It's 4 minutes.
Yeah.
A woman's
Lynch has been
dark
so many.
and absurdist nightmare
Bro,
vision.
Lynch did this one
compromising a
called The
continuous
Grandma.
recitation of the alphabet.
Yeah, Lynch
I
did this
mean,
one called like The Grandma or The Mother or something. That
Jesus.
shit's so fucking weird. Like he's done so many of these, honestly. There's so many.
That's
Yeah, my favorite from the 60s is definitely obviously Psycho, but Rosemary's Baby I really enjoy as well. I think like the new American Horror Story season is like basically a remake of Rosemary's Baby is what they're going for. Like they're
Is it?
it's
Okay.
like I'm pretty sure that's what I'm getting from the vibes of the trailer. And then obviously like Hereditary is very much so inspired by Rosemary's Baby, but
Yeah.
Rosemary's Baby is really good. Psycho's but definitely my favorite psychological horror from the 60s. But those are the only two I've seen technically. I would say Persona definitely can be classified as one though, but in elements of it. But yeah, Rosemary's Baby and Psycho are both great. 60s was solid.
60s was solid. We can move on to the 70s, which I think is I don't think psychological horror truly boomed.
There's not as
until,
many. Like,
yeah, until like the 80s. But again, I'm seeing a lot of people include like untraditional, I guess, psychological horror movies on these lists. Like I'm looking at this list that has Halloween, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Black Christmas, which I guess prominently are slasher films, but when you, I guess, put them in a psychological lens, you know, Laurie Strode, is, for example, is absolutely going through it that entire movie. So you can look at it as a psychological movie, but
it's like Suspiria as well. Like Suspiria is like a psychological, but it's also like supernatural.
I think Suspiria is more true psychological than like a Halloween, but it also has those supernatural elements.
Supernatural elements. Yeah.
The same thing with like a Carrie. Like Carrie, I think is not a traditional psychological horror.
Carrie's
movie.
an interesting one.
But
Yeah.
it's funny because like Brian De Palma is like, he is like a more reserved psychological filmmaker than, you know, I would say like a John Carpenter is, or like a Ridley Scott. Like, because you can also look at like Alien as a slightly psychological horror, even though I think it's more of like a, you know, science fiction horror than a psychological horror.
Yeah, I mean the Wicker Man, the original could count as it. That's similar to like a Midsummer kind of thing. Also,
Yeah.
I want you both to search
Oh,
The
God.
Grandmother, because that was 1970 David Lynch. It was a year right after.
Bro,
Just search, look at the header. That's good
oh
though.
my
Like, it's
God.
hard to find, but it's actually good. Like, that's psychological as fuck. That was creepy.
That header looks like Heath Ledger's Joker without the
It
makeup.
does, doesn't it? Yeah, it does.
That's
That was some
fucked.
weird shit. That's definitely like some psychological stuff. It was like an animated weird film that he did, and he's done a lot of these shorts. They're really interesting, actually. But yeah, that's definitely constitutes it.
Is David Lynch like okay?
No, have you seen
Like-
his film? You watched
like-
Eraserhead,
like-
bro? What do you mean? No, this guy's not.
Yeah,
Oh,
he-
there's gonna be one that you'll definitely mention for the 80s. Actually, I know which one you have to.
Well, let's get right to the 80s.
I know which one you're gonna say.
That I'm definitely gonna mention. What? The Shining, obviously.
Oh yeah, I mean definitely, but no, like I think this is a psychological one.
Which one? What are you talking about? The Fly?
Angst.
Oh yeah.
I mean that's like
yeah, that's like the most. That for me is the most realistic depiction of a serial killer I've seen in film. And have you
Yeah.
seen Angst?
Yeah.
You have. Tyler, you have not.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll
not
like
for
just a quick
like,
explanation. So
3 years.
basically, in Angst, this notorious serial killer is let out from prison, like his sentence is up, and he immediately goes back to like he finds a house, just a random house, starts torturing these people and killing them. But while he's doing so, like the entire movie, you're kind of being guided by his narration. So I said this in my Letterboxd review. It's very rare in horror that we have a movie where your point of view is from the point of view of the bad guy. And then this guy in Angst just had like skin crawling. Like he was so calm about like what he was talking about. He was literally just like, well, I need to find some people. Oh, these two girls at the end of the bar, they're staring at me. Maybe they'll be good to torture and kill or something. It's like so like haunting just because of how composed and like how calm this guy is about like what he's talking about. And then Seth, I'm sure you'll agree, just like the sequences of violence are just so grotesque and so realistically like brutal that they just that movie.
It's
God.
the way it builds up to that certain point by putting you in his head and actually getting you comfortable with the idea and then shocking you out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's a really interesting film. Actually, you don't see many films from that perspective. I think I need to rewatch it. It's been like 3 years, I think, minimum.
Yeah, that was a first watch for me, like not too long ago, and everyone kept saying like, prepare yourself like to like not want to watch a movie for quite some time after.
Yeah, so I would also say so Brian De Palma did a film called Dress to Kill, which I would consider thriller, but apparently it's horror. Oh, horror is the main genre here. Okay, that's definitely a psychological one. Really, really interesting film about like basically a female murderer who's murdering a psychiatrist's patients. Really, really interesting. I think you both actually really like that. Quite a controversial one at the time, I believe. But then in terms of the psychological, I think like what I'm looking at from the 80s, this was kind of the period where like there was more body horror. The practical effects are utilized a lot. You know, we've got like The Thing, The Day of the Dead, American Werewolf in London, Videodrome, The Fly, Evil Dead, even The Shining to a certain extent, Nightmare on Elm Street. And I think this was definitely a case where things were starting to come in with that. And then also, George, you had like you know that zombie director, Lucio Fulci, did that zombie flesh eaters guy?
Yeah, zombie flesh eaters. I
watched
shout out Stoney the Great. He had recommended me that last year's horror season. Yeah, that's a good one.
Have you seen The Beyond? I watched that the other day.
No.
Bro,
The Beyond?
Yeah, I think he's the most popular one on Letterboxd. Lucio Fulci is crazy.
I think Zombie Flesh Eater is the only Fulci movie I've seen, so I need to continue. Maybe not like horror. I know a lot of people consider it thriller, but The Silence of the Lambs.
If you think it's horror, it's
bugging.
Definitely.
Well, I'm bugging. That's a '90s movie.
Oh, Possession actually is actually a psychological horror film.
Possession. Okay.
Yeah, Possession.
I'm bugging.
Is.
We'll talk about Silence of the Lambs later. But yeah, even like Poltergeist, obviously a little bit more supernatural, but psychological in a sense. John Carpenter's Prince of Darkness. Damn, the 80s were sick for horror.
Yeah, the 80s were really good. The 80s were good for horror. And I don't think they were that strong. Otherwise, I watched a lot of shit in the 80s, man.
Yeah, there's a lot of shit in horror just all the time.
No, like in general, I think the 80s were like a weird period
Just
for film
generally,
in general. But
yeah.
horror, they were really good. Horror, they were really good.
Tyler, anything from the 80s that you want to shout out that you've seen?
The only like notable one is The Shining, which obviously is the first one everyone would think of for when it comes to psychological horror from the 80s.
For sure.
Yeah,
That's still my greatest horror movie of all time. I said, like, before, I think it was early September, I had posted a TikTok video, like my top 30 horror movies of all time. And in that video, I was like, yeah, over the next like 2 months, I'm going to be watching like a lot of first watch horror movies. So I expect this list to look very different come Halloween. The list doesn't look that different at all.
My top 3 hasn't moved since I was like 16. It's
Yeah,
kinda weird,
my
you know what I
top
mean?
like 20. I think the only addition into like the top 25 was Angst. I
Oh,
think
really?
that was it.
Interesting.
Angst, Opera. I think that's it. I think those are the only ones that like slid their way into like my top of the top horror movies. And I've been watching a ton over the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.